Welcome to the debate. Today we are putting on our climbing gear and standing at the foot of what many consider the Mount Everest of theology, specifically the doctrine of salvation. We are cracking open the Gospel of John, chapter 6, verse 44.
And it's a text that has launched 1,000 theological ships and, probably sunk a few too. No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him.
Exactly. And the stakes couldn't be higher. This verse is, it's often cited as the fortress of the doctrine of total inability. It forces us to ask a terrifyingly simple question. Does this verse teach that God, in eternity past, unilaterally selected a specific group of people and effectively drags them to salvation while leaving the rest unable to move? Or is there something else going on in the history of the first century?
It's the classic clash, isn't it, between God's sovereignty and human responsibility. I'll be arguing that we often read a 16th century debate back into a first century Jewish context. My position is that John 6:44 isn't really about a pretemporal selection of the elect, but rather it's describing a specific historical moment, a sheep transfer, if you will, where the Father is handing over his faithful followers from the Old Covenant to the Messiah.
And I'm representing the view that this text is the bedrock of sovereign grace. I'll be arguing that man is so broken by sin that he is morally unable to choose God without a supernatural, effectual drawing by the Father. So let's get into the weeds. I want to start by laying out the architecture of what we call the golden chain of salvation right there in John 6.
I love a good chain analogy. Lay it out for us.
Well, it's pretty inescapable when you read the chapter. You have verse 37, all that the Father gives me will come to me. Then you have our focus, verse 44, no one can come unless the Father draws him. And then finally, verse 65, no one can come unless it has been granted him from the Father.
It's certainly a rhythmic repetition. Jesus is really hammering a point home.
He is. And the weight of the whole argument rests on three, I think, terrifying words. No one can. This isn't a statement about permission. It's a statement about ability, or, the lack of it. The text doesn't say no one will come, which would imply they just don't want to. It says no one can come.
So you view this as a kind of diagnosis of the human condition?
Precisely. It's a spiritual MRI. It shows that the human heart, in its natural state, is not just sick, it's dead. It is hostile to God. Therefore, the drawing mentioned here, it can't be a polite invitation. I mean, you don't invite a corpse to dinner. If the sinner is unable, the drawing must be effectual. It has to be an internal, supernatural act where God changes the heart, effectively causing them to come. It ensures salvation is 100% God's work, monergism, to use the technical term. A one-way street of effort, and 0% man's free will.
I appreciate the clarity of that system. It's very logical. If you accept the premise that cannot means born without the capacity, then the rest falls into place. But I want to challenge that premise by looking at the timeline. You're quoting John 6:44, but I would argue that we are effectively living in the reality of John 12:32.
That's a jump. You'll have to unpack that distinction for the listeners.
We have to look at who Jesus is talking to. He isn't speaking to a Gentile audience in 2024. He is speaking to a very specific, hostile crowd of Jewish grumblers in Capernaum. These were people who claimed to know God. They had the Torah, they claimed to be disciples of Moses, but here's the irony. They were rejecting Jesus.
Right. They were rejecting the very person Moses wrote about.
Exactly. So my argument is that the Calvinist view just ignores this immediate audience. The giving and drawing in John 6 refers to the Father handing over his already faithful followers to the Messiah. Think of people like Simeon, Anna, or Nathaniel. These were people who genuinely loved the Father under the Old Covenant. When the Son arrived, the Father drew these specific sheep to the Son.
So hold on, you're limiting the scope of the verse entirely to that moment in history? That feels like you're shrinking the text.
I'm not shrinking it, I'm grounding it. It's a sheep transfer. The Father is taking those who, and he says this in verse 45, heard and learned from him, and he is giving them to Jesus. It's not some mystical zap of an unwilling rebel. It's the natural response of a faithful heart recognizing the Father's voice in the Son. I mean, if this were about total inability,
Why would Jesus rebuke them for not listening to the Father? The implication is that if they had truly listened to the Father and Moses, they would have come to Jesus naturally.
That's a compelling narrative, I'll grant you, but I think it softens the text too much. You're underplaying the sheer force of the word draw. The Greek word here is helko. It's a violent word.
Violent? How so?
Well, it's used in James 2:6 to describe rich men dragging poor men into court. It's used in Acts to describe dragging Paul and Silas into the marketplace. It's used to describe dragging a heavy net full of fish. You don't woo a net full of tuna. You don't invite a prisoner into a cell. You drag them. Force is applied to overcome resistance. That is what God does to the sinner. He drags the unwilling heart until it becomes willing.
I knew you'd go to the drag definition. It's the favorite argument in this debate. And yeah, it paints a picture of God acting like a police officer arresting a suspect. But I have to push back. If you insist that helko means to drag effectually without the possibility of resistance, you walk right into a massive theological trap.
I'm listening. Which trap is that?
Universalism. The idea that everyone gets saved, regardless of what they believe.
How does drawing lead to universalism? That seems like the exact opposite of election.
Well, look at John 12:32. Jesus uses the exact same word, helko. He says, "And I, if I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all men to myself." Now, apply your definition. If draw means compel effectually or irresistibly drag to salvation, and Jesus draws all men, then every single human being must be saved.
I see where you're going.
You have a dilemma. As a Calvinist, you definitely don't believe in universalism. You believe only the elect are saved. So, you have to choose. Either all men doesn't mean all men, or draw doesn't mean irresistibly drag. You can't have both. You can't just change the definition of the word because the chapter number changed.
That is the standard objection. And generally, the Reformed response is that all men in John 12:32 means all types of men, Jews and Gentiles alike, not every individual head for head. Jesus is saying he will draw people from every tribe and tongue, not just from the Jews.
That feels like convenient linguistic gymnastics to save the definition from John 6. You have to squint pretty hard at all men to make it mean some men of all types. But let's just look at the context of John 6:45, the very next verse. Jesus defines the drawing for us. He doesn't leave it ambiguous.
Go on.
He says, "It is written in the prophets, and they shall all be taught by God. Everyone who has heard and learned from the Father comes to me." See? The method of drawing isn't mechanical dragging, like a net. It's cognitive. It's teaching and learning. It's relational.
But hold on, isn't that teaching itself the supernatural work? You're suggesting that hearing and learning is just a natural human process like learning math, but surely, given the deadness of the sinner's heart, that teaching must be the regenerating work of the Spirit. The sinner can't learn unless God opens the ears first. The dead can't learn.
Not in this context. Look at the example of Nathanael in John chapter 1. It's the perfect case study. Jesus sees Nathanael and acknowledges his faith before Nathanael even clearly knows who Jesus is. He calls him an Israelite in whom is no deceit. Nathanael was a man who had heard and learned from the Father through the Old Testament scriptures.
So he was a faithful Jew.
Exactly. When he met Jesus, he didn't need to be raised from the dead spiritually. He just needed an introduction. The Father drew him by revealing the Son. No coercion was needed because he was already a willing student of the Father. The drawing is the Father saying, "Here is the one you have been waiting for." The text explicitly links the drawing to hearing and learning, not being zapped and regenerated.
I'm still not convinced by that line of reasoning because it sidesteps the cannot. Let's go back to verse 44. No one can come. This speaks to ability. If I say no one can jump to the moon, it's not because they won't try, it's because they lack the physical capacity. The text suggests that all humans are born dead rebel sinners, haters of God. Unless the Father intervenes, they cannot come. You seem to be suggesting these people were capable of coming on their own if they just studied hard enough?
I agree that cannot implies an inability. Absolutely. But we disagree on the source of that inability. You say it's a birth defect, total depravity inherited from Adam. I'm arguing, based on the prophets Jesus is quoting, that it is judicial hardening.
Okay, let's slow down. Judicial hardening. That sounds technical. Explain the difference for our listeners.
Think of a criminal in court. Total depravity says the criminal is born unable to follow the law. He has no capacity for goodness. Judicial hardening says the criminal refused to follow the law so many times that the judge finally bangs the gavel and says, "Fine, you are now locked up." The inability comes after the rejection, not before.
And you see that in this text?
Look at the parallel in John 12:39-40. John quotes Isaiah 6. For this reason they could not believe. Why? Because he has blinded their eyes and he hardened their heart. This is a specific judgment on Israel for centuries of rejecting the prophets. God hides the truth from the proud and reveals it to infants, the humble. Jesus praises the Father for this in Matthew 11. The grumblers in John 6 cannot come because they are currently under judgment for rejecting the Father's previous revelation.
But that implies their rejection of Moses was a free choice that they could have gotten right.
Yes. Jesus says it himself in John 5:46. If you believed Moses, you would believe me. The logic implies that believing Moses was possible for them. The problem wasn't a lack of elected status from eternity past. The problem was they didn't actually love God. They loved the praise of men. They were playing religion, not seeking God.
I struggle with the idea of separating the Father's work from the Son's work so sharply. You're distinguishing between a Father's drawing in John 6 and the Son's drawing in John 12. But isn't God one? I mean, why this complexity? Why would the Father draw some and the Son draw others?
The complexity exists because the Bible puts it there. In John 6, strictly speaking, the Father is the active agent. He is validating the Son. He is taking the remnant, the faithful Jews, and handing them to Jesus. But notice what happens in John 12:32. Jesus says, "And I, if I am lifted up, will draw all men." After the cross, the authority to draw is given to the Son.
So let me get this straight. You're saying the "no one can come" of John 6:44 it's essentially expired? It's no longer in effect?
In the strict sense of that specific covenantal transfer, yes. We are now in the age where the Son is drawing all people. Look, if the John 6:44 drawing, this alleged irresistible dragging of the elect, was the standard way God saved people for all time, then John 12:32 is redundant. Why would Jesus speak of a future drawing? I will draw. If the Father was already doing the necessary dragging for everyone, it just doesn't make sense to promise the future drawing if the mechanism is already fully operational.
That is a compelling argument, I'll admit. The shift in tense from Father draws to I will draw is significant. However, I'd contend that the Father initiates and the Son accomplishes, and maybe the redundancy is just a reaffirmation of the Trinity's cooperative work. But I want to pivot to history for a moment, because we aren't the first people to have this argument.
Far from it.
The interpretation I'm presenting of human inability and divine sovereignty is the Orthodox Reformed understanding. It protects the glory of God. It ensures that we don't take credit for our salvation. The view you're presenting feels like it places the deciding factor in the hands of man, which feels, well, risky. It feels like we're robbing God of his glory.
It's fascinating you bring up history and orthodoxy. Because if we actually go back to the early church fathers, I'm talking about the guys who learned from the disciples of the apostles, we find something pretty startling, specifically in John Chrysostom, the golden-mouthed preacher of the 4th century.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What did Chrysostom say?
Chrysostom notes that there was a group of people who absolutely loved John 6:44. I mean, they had it on their coffee mugs. They loved the phrase, "no one can come." And they used it to argue that nothing lies in our own power and that human natures are fixed. Some are created good, some evil.
You're talking about the Gnostics.
Specifically, the Manichaean Gnostics. They believed matter was evil and spirit was good, and you were stuck in one or the other. Chrysostom points out that the Gnostics asked the exact same question modern Calvinists ask. If a man comes to him, what need is there of drawing? They used that logic to deny free will.
Wait, are you saying my view is Gnostic? That's a heavy charge.
I'm saying that the early church, including Chrysostom, explicitly rejected the reading of cannot that you are defending. They argued that drawing implies we need assistance, yes, much succor, as he puts it, but it does not remove the human will. It is deeply ironic that the interpretation now called Reformed Orthodoxy was, in the early centuries, the argument used by the heretics against the Church. The Church defended free will against those who used John 6:44 to preach inability.
That is a stinging historical point. But there is a massive difference between Gnostic determinism, which is based on material natures, like being born a rock versus a bird, and the biblical doctrine of election, which is based on God's free grace and love. We aren't saying people are saved because they have a golden nature, but because God chose them despite their sin.
I understand the distinction you're making, and it is an important one. You aren't a Manichaean, but the functional result regarding the cannot is identical. Both views leave the individual without a mechanism to respond unless they are pre-programmed to do so. And this leads me to the purpose of the discourse in John 6. Why did Jesus even say it?
Well, that's my question to you. Why would Jesus look at a crowd and say, "No one can come unless the Father draws him," if he wasn't teaching them a seminary class about their inability and his sovereignty?
It wasn't a theology seminar. It was a rebuke. Imagine you're at a party and someone claims to be best friends with the host. But when the host walks in, that person ignores him completely. You would say, "You claim to know the host? Impossible. If you actually knew him, you'd be talking to him right now."
Okay, I see the analogy.
These Jews were proud. They claimed, "We are children of Abraham. We know God." Jesus is essentially saying, "You claim to know the Father? Impossible. If you actually knew the Father, he would be drawing you to me right now. The very fact that you are rejecting me is proof that you don't know him." It attacks their religious pride. It tells them that their so-called connection to God is a sham. It's not a sentence of doom about their eternal non-election. It's a challenge to get right with the Father so they can recognize the Son.
I see the rhetorical power in that. It certainly fits the conflict with the Pharisees. It turns the verse from a metaphysical statement about human nature into a relational indictment of that specific crowd. However, I still feel the weight of the text itself. When I read, "No one can come," it humbles me. It tells me that my salvation did not originate in my wisdom or my learning, but in God's initiative. Even if there's a historical sheep transfer happening, surely the principle remains. We are dependent on God's initiative.
Absolutely. We agree that salvation is of the Lord. No one saves themselves. No one wakes up one day and just invents the idea of seeking Christ without God revealing himself first. But the question is about the nature of that initiative. Is it a selective drag that overcomes the will, or is it a gracious revelation that invites the will to respond? Is God dragging a corpse, or is he teaching a student?
I admit the distinction between the Father's drawing in John 6 and the Son's drawing in John 12 introduces a complexity that the standard Calvinist reading has to work very hard to harmonize. The idea that Jesus takes over the drawing after the cross, it does solve the universalism problem of drawing all men. If draw means drag, then universalism is very hard to avoid in chapter 12. And I certainly don't want to end up a universalist.
And it honors the context. It explains why Jesus is so harsh with them, because they should have known better. They had Moses. They had the prophets. They had the capacity to listen, but they hardened their hearts.
Though I would still argue that hearing and learning from the Father requires a grace that they rejected, perhaps showing the depth of their depravity.
Or the depth of their stubbornness. As Stephen said in Acts, you always resist the Holy Spirit. Resistance is the tragedy of the Jewish rejection. If the drawing were irresistible, their resistance would be impossible and their judgment would be unjust. How can you judge a man for resisting a force that is allegedly irresistible?
That is the paradox we find ourselves in. We are coming to the end of our time, and we've covered a lot of ground. To summarize my position, despite the historical nuances you've raised, and they are significant, I believe John 6:44 stands as a testament to the necessity of divine intervention. The human will is bound by sin, and only the Father's drawing can liberate it. The sheep transfer may be the immediate context, but the theological principle of inability stands firm.
And to summarize my view, context is king. John 6 is about the unique historical transition of authority from the Father to the Son. It explains why the religious leaders miss the Messiah. not because they weren't picked in eternity past, but because they weren't listening to the God they claimed to serve. God does draw people, but the method changes after the cross to a universal appeal, John 12:32. So the verse isn't a sentence of doom for the non-elect, but a challenge to be taught of God, to humble oneself so that the light of Christ can be received.
It is certainly a passage that demands we read it with our eyes wide open, not just skimming the surface or relying on tradition.
Indeed, and perhaps looking for that connection between learning from the Father and coming to the Son is the key to unlocking it.
Thank you for a rigorous exchange. It's good to have these assumptions challenged.
A pleasure as always.
And thank you for listening to The Debate. We'll see you next time.